So the title of my PhD thesis now is You Messed with the Wrong Generation, Resilience and Protest Motivations Among Young Myanmar Pro-Democracy Activists in Exile. I know it's a lot, but the quote basically become the phrase that has become famous after this generation rose in response to the 2021 military coup. They say this is enough. And I wanted to explore why is it enough and why are they so resilient in their resistance? And yeah, let's see what I found. This is just a brief overview of what I'm going to do. You know the stuff. So it's going to be an introduction, a bit of a historical prologue, what's been happening in Myanmar, the research question, the design, the findings, the obvious flaws, and then I'll be most delighted to discuss with you what you think about the research, how it relates to you, and what you think needs to be improved. Just as a brief context why I'm interested in this topic, there was a short period of democratization in Myanmar between 2011 to 2021. And I was privileged to work there as a peace worker in Myanmar, really my first full job. So I worked in a small community. You can see it on the map in the north. The red area is called Kachin State, right next to Yunnan province in China, where different ethnic groups have been fighting for generations. So I was in a small community school. You can see my students there at the bottom. I've been teaching research methods in English and political science. So really, really great experience. And that really inspired me because they started to go to a lot of protests, resisting the military that committed atrocities and extrajudicial killings. And that was something that was not possible before, to go to a protest and not get arrested. So I was drawn in. I was sometimes marching, and I got into trouble with the German embassy because they said you're not supposed to be political while you're there. You're supposed to be impartial, which was very hard. So I started to see that young people really tried to get into politics. So I wanted to explore this more. And I was annoyed with the fact that people started to call me a Myanmar expert just because I had lived there for a year or two, and I wanted to actually study and to have a little more credibility to talk about the topic. So yeah, that's why I applied for a PhD. It took a little bit longer because of the pandemic, and originally I have a background in sinology and Asian studies, and then I did another certificate degree in sustainable development. Now, just a very brief history of Myanmar. After independence from the British, the military took over. They're basically ruling the country with an iron fist. There were several uprisings, none of them successful. The most famous, maybe in 1988, also very visible, was, of course, the Saffron Revolution, where we saw all the monks protesting the military. And then in 2011, apparently after secret negotiations with the US, suddenly the military announced that there would be free and fair elections and democratic reforms. So we now talk about this as a democratization period. Some call it disciplined democracy. No matter what happened there in 2011, 21, after the military lost yet another election, they called the elections rigged and staged a military coup. However, the nation rose in protest, and despite expectations of upside, the observers did not collapse, but continues to fight. And this was a very early assessment of one of the leading experts on the security situation in Myanmar, Anthony Davis, who said the military will win in the end, basically referring historical evidence and saying it's always the same. There's an uprising, and then the military just destroys it. And basically, a little bit later, he made a public U-turn in a public interview, where he basically said he now believes that the revolution could actually win this, because he says, I entirely underestimated the anger, determination, and sheer courage of Burma's youth as a nationwide phenomenon, committed themselves to a revolution aimed at overturning the entire military-controlled order. There are at least three surprises for people that study social movements and youth activism. First of all is, why is the resistance so resilient in the first place, without any outside supporters, and no proxy, and no one who is really channeling funds and money to them? Secondly, why are there so many young women and young people that are leading this revolution? When in the past, it was mostly Burma and mostly elderly revolutionaries. And then very counterintuitive is also the fact that we see an improvement in inter-ethnic relations. And we know from other civil wars, for example, in the Balkans, that whenever there's a civil war, inter-ethnic tensions also actually get worse. So this is all very surprising and all relates to my research question as well. So here just very briefly what the research questions were and how the logic is. So the question is, why are exiled youth activists of the Spring Revolution, referring to the civilian resistance against the military, so resilient in their opposition to the 2021 military coup d'etat of the junta in Myanmar? There were three sub-questions. Why do exiled youth activists join and remain in the pro-democracy movement? How do they perceive, express, and organize their resistance? And what are the social political aspirations of youth activists for the post-conflict order? And I will touch upon this again and again, but analyzing the data, I really saw that it made most sense to start with the values. So this was the first chapter. What are the values that they believe in? The lofty goals, so to speak. And from there, then I relate also to more intrinsic motivations. Of course, and this relates to the big debate in political psychology and social movement studies. What are the motivations that compel people to resist and risk their lives? So that's the next chapter. Then from there, I try to relate to how do they resist, the repertoires of contention. And last but not least, what are the very explicit, clear political aspirations that they have? What do they want to change? And of course, I will not get into this because I assume most of you are experts on this, but I relied heavily on social movements research. And I will just give you a brief answer here to the question, and I will summarize it again in the conclusion. So part of the answer to the research question seems to be that young people are motivated by being part of a diverse protest collective, which also continuously fosters their sense of duty to resist and additionally kindles the anger towards the military junta. That's a lot to unpack. It basically means that I found three traditional protest motivations that are most predominant. The first that triggers everything seems to be emotions. After the military coup, there's fear and shock and anger. Mostly people are not scared. They're just very, very angry. And what happens then? They take to the streets in the beginning very spontaneously. We do not have a lot of evidence that there was any expectations of the coup. Some people predicted it, but most people wouldn't believe it. There was mostly just really surprise. But people are really enraged. They take to the streets. And this is where we see that we have protest communities building. At the same time, people really see that what they're fighting for, which is freedom, democracy, and especially after the military starts to kill them, that they have a moral obligation to protest because they believe that their values and their goals are better than what the military wants, not only for them, but for the country as a whole. So these three are the most dominant protest motivations that I found, although some of the others definitely play a role. This is the design that I relied on. So it's a sequential exploratory design, which means it leans heavily on qualitative methods. And this would be step 1 and 2. So the first step was a text analysis of political statements by youth organizations that I systematically downloaded and analyzed through a reflexive thematic analysis by Braun and Clark. Then I spent quite some time, 7 months in Thailand at the Myanmar-Thai border because it's not possible to travel to Myanmar at the moment. DFAT regulations and all that. So I had to interview exiled youth activists. And last but not least, and Winifred was extremely helpful with this, I developed an online survey that was supposed to rely on what is called systemic consensing to try to figure out what are the least controversial political goals and values that the resistance can rely on, because studying Myanmar also means to realize that it's a very fractured resistance. There are lots of ethnic groups, lots of odd bedfellows. So I tried to figure out how could this research project be actually of practical value for the revolution, to figure out what could be some of the common ground that we could talk about to form an alliance, or maybe for future peace talks to have a common ground for negotiations. Unfortunately, I ran out of money, funding, and time, and got stuck at 49 responses. So I'm currently looking for more money to finalize this survey. So I had to basically submit my thesis without the survey. It was really, really painful, but my supervisors, who probably know best, had to convince me to just do that, to get it done with and take a break. But that is still something that I'm rooting for. And my supervisor, Max Grumping, and I are currently trying to look for funding because he would be interested to co-publish something on that survey and then hopefully transform it into a book at some point. Good. Just a few expressions from the field work. I spent a lot of time in safe houses, at public protests, university campuses, restaurants, libraries, really usually the places, of course, that young people I wanted to talk with suggested. And extremely important became just to be there, to build trust. That's very common, but also I started to become a community volunteer. So I was teaching, I was helping people with drafts, with submission for funding, and that really became part of the whole ethical approach. And I'm currently writing an article on this. Very briefly, just a few idea how who my interviewees were. So I aimed to have at least 50% of women. I succeeded in that. So half were women, and then 36% men. And I had 4 or 5 members of the LGBTIQ plus community, which was also great because if you saw the protests in the beginning, they were also really outspoken, very powerful in the public protests. Then the ethnic majority of Burma makes up around 50-60% of the population. I wanted to have mainly ethnic minorities, so that also worked out. I had only 27% of the ethnic Burma, and the rest are from various ethnic minorities. And if you have a look at the word cloud that basically analyzes the transcripts of my interviews, 2 things become very clear. It's a very binary conflict. On the one hand, you see the people. Young people always talk about us, the people, and the military, that's they. So it's us versus them. Very classical, very exacerbated conflict. And yeah, if you just have a look at a few of the other words that were very predominant in the interviews, you can see that a lot of action words. Yeah, they believe, they believe in a revolution. They feel, they think about their friends. So lots of powerful words that really relate to the community and what they want to do. So the key findings, I mentioned again, I will talk about values, protest motivations, repertoires of contention, and political aspirations. We will zoom in a little bit. What time do I have left? Still good, 9 minutes, yeah. So, okay. Good. Chapter 5, where it really everything starts. Here, a quote by Daisy, and I really think about human rights democracy. So what I'm basically finding is that the short time of democratization exposed a lot of people in their formative years to international CSOs and to also CSOs that had to work from the Thai-Myanmar border while the Myanmar military was in power. So most of them attended some kind of youth empowerment trainings. They were funded, they went to embassies, they interacted with NGOs, they started to learn English for the first time really well. There was a whole, one journalist called it an aid caravan of people coming into the country, offering lots of trainings and services. So I argue that these formative years were really important because the belief in democracy, human rights, civic freedoms, equality, justice, and education and development was really, really predominant. This is what they talked about. Whenever it's about like, why are you resisting this? Like, this is what we fight for. We've lived in this kind of context. We've tasted democracy. We can't go back to a military regime. We'll rather die. Yeah, so sensory descriptions were very important. Here we have a quote by Goseng where she says, like, they've faced the taste of democracy and they don't want to lose it. So the taste or sensory or smell came up again and again. So it was really important. Then I basically have this one twice. So we talked about this. So the combination that I find is very potent of anger, protest communities, and moral obligation. When it comes to repertoires of contention, yeah, we see that there was this one situation where I thought I really don't understand what's going on because she said, we donate the lipsticks. And I was like, what do you mean lipsticks? And she's like, oh, they look like bullets. So we always talk in code because we also don't know if the Thai authorities are listening, but we send lipsticks over the border. So very creative. They've come up often with language, with their own strategies to find loopholes. And this is, of course, can be described by Scott as the weapons of the weak. And it's been recently called in another paper as everyday activism. That's a common term as well. So they use everything at their disposal. whatever skills they have, whether it be cooking, teaching, online content, they try to weaponize it to resist this military. And now, something that may be a little bit of a tiny contribution maybe to the debate is the way I try to frame the spectrum of tactics. And this is where I came up with the idea to form it from destructive to constructive. So, and I find that in my sample, of course, it's mostly on the constructive side, meaning they are doing things that are heavily related to community empowerment, conflict resolution trainings. They're teaching, they're trying to get funds for refugees. But of course, if I would interview people in the country, and I've done that with a few via Zoom, many of them are engaged in what we may have to frame as terrorism, so armed resistance in the cities, but also in the countryside, fundraising for arms. And a lot of them are very pragmatic. They say we do both. When we're in a community, we really try to help if we're responsible to help them, but we also try to get funding for weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a spectrum where a lot of them move along this kind of line from left to right, whatever works and whatever they're good at. Talking about political demands, this is also not surprising because this is something that you can measure and find in all the online statements. What I already mentioned, they demand demilitarization. Some of the less radical ones say we just have to put the military under civilian control. Others say we have to completely dissolve the military and reform it because they're so toxic. We can't use them anymore. We have to dissolve it. They want federal democracy. They want finally better education and development. They want ethnic equality. And I say they don't stop short of basically what they want is a revolution. They want a national reconstruction. Something that I find very strongly is that they're thinking about a completely different ethnic identity, a national identity of people who live in Myanmar, much more inclusive, LGBTIQ community, women, ethnic minorities, young people need to have a seat at the table. And yeah, this is what they really fight for. Good. This is the whole thesis basically in one messy visualization from left to right, from core values to protest motivations, repertoires of contention, political aspirations. I've tried to visualize how they all relate. And yeah, that's basically the thesis in a nutshell. I'll just leave that there for a minute. It's probably too much to take it all in, but I'm glad to share it later. Okay, limitations. I did my best to learn Burmese. I didn't realize until after I got the offer for a PhD at Griffith that they actually don't offer Burmese language. I should have tried for ANU in that case. So I tried it with a private teacher, but yeah, it was difficult. But it was a really good icebreaker and often showed the community respect when I tried to crack a few jokes and use Burmese here and there. That helped. But I was also very privileged because a lot of the young people I interviewed spoke excellent English. And whenever a translation was necessary, I relied on trusted community interpreters, which is a common job for people fleeing from Myanmar anyway. So that's why I could rechannel funds from Griffiths to young people who really needed it. So that was actually also not too bad. Then there's the unfinished survey. So the mixed methods interpretation is not ready, and I think it would yield a lot of interesting results to combine the qual and quant data. So that's something that I'm working on. And I think trying to measure how those values and motivations change over time in a longitudinal study would probably find that it's changed and yield more interesting insights. So maybe a follow-up project. Good. Some of the implications. First of all, the focus on moral obligation as being important for young people has been something that has already been suggested by another study during the transition period. And I find that it has even become more important. It's really central to how young people act. So yeah, I hope I can write an article. I'm writing another one, but writing articles soon where I basically relate to those findings by Stepness and her colleagues. and confirm that this also translates into the revolutionary period. Then, of course, it also relates to the call to, instead of focusing on autocrats and dictatorships, also on the agents of resistance, as it has been called. So there's a contribution here. And of course, it also contributes to the ongoing debate about which protest variables are the most important in various settings, which is of course also where you, Winifred, have contributed to. So yeah, excited about that. Empirically, I tried to make this a bit spicy, Winifred, because I found in your paper that you said that there's an assumption that radicalization and lower support for democracy can arise as a response to groups' previous failed conventional actions. You also admit that the social political context in terms of education, wealth, westernization, and democratization, so weird countries, may not be generalizable in other contexts. So that's exactly what I find. I find that after trying conventional methods to resist, people radicalize, but they're becoming more democratic and more inclusive, which is an interesting finding, I think. Theoretically, of course, minor contributions, I believe, but for example, the idea to study the repertoires on a spectrum from destructive to constructive, and methodologically to study a movement from the inside out. So from the why to the how and what, from values, motivations, repertoires to aspirations. And practically, I still believe that even without the survey, some of the findings may be really interesting for actors in humanitarian aid, political aspirations, and humanitarian needs. As you know, Winifred, maybe you've seen it. I've just spoken on the situation in Myanmar. I was interviewed by Sky News, and there I could also draw on my findings. And it felt right for the first time. I feel like, okay, I'm moving in the direction of becoming maybe something like an expert. Good. So again, research question: why are exiled youth activists of the Spring Revolution so resilient in their opposition to the 2021 military coup? And this is from I just posted from my, copied and pasted from my PhD thesis that I just submitted. The concise answer is that young people who have not left the movement are so resilient because they have a robust, coherent value system that they have instilled and often practiced during a time of relative freedom and liberalization from 2011 to 2021, before the coup, that compels them to resist. This explains the anger and sense of moral obligation towards their community, which is suffering under military suppression, and their nuanced, often creative resistance tactics, ranging from destructive to constructive, as well as their political aspirations that are diametrically opposed to the current military rule. Okay, and here I just have a few discussion questions, such as what were moments in my presentation where you were like, oh, wait a minute, that's not right, or I've heard this before, or what is new about that? But I'm also interested to hear how you think how we as scholars can engage normatively with youth activism in global contexts. What is the success formula to resist authoritarianism, which becomes a problem? And how does my project relate to your own interests and research? And what is your explanation to explain resilient resistance? I'm very keen to hear those. So yeah, that's really it. And thank you for your attention.